This is Comic Shenanigans, episode 1037, a conversation with Joe Rubinstein.
Ain't no stopping them shenanigans. Love getting into shenanigans. All up in them shenanigans. 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 Shenanigans.
Welcome to the Comic Shenanigans podcast. This is episode 1037. This is a conversation with Joe Rubinstein. Joe is a very acclaimed and well-known inker in the industry. So we get into, his comic book work. What was it like working in the industry, breaking in? What was it like working on some particularly acclaimed runs? Kind of talks about his process and how he felt about the process of inking. We talk about his legendary work on the official Handbook of the Marvel Universe, where he inked every image, which he kind of gets into how that happened as well. So this is a really fun conversation with me and Joe, kind of breaking down his career. We talk about particular runs, especially he worked on Ron Frenz in a few different moments. He did his Superman work, and he was also doing his Amazing Spider-Man work. So we kind of talk about what it was like to work with Ron as well, because obviously Ron is a good friend of the show. So it's always nice to hear about some of the collaborators that Ron has worked with over the years. So this was a really fun conversation with me and Joe, and I hope you enjoy it. You can email me at comicshenanigans@gmail.com, rate the show on iTunes or Apple Podcasts, listen to an Apple Podcast, and also listen to us on Spotify. And also upcoming next episode, next week, we're going to have our next Book of the Month Club episode, this time for April. And this time we're looking at Spider-Man Web of Life and Web of Death from 1994, as well as Funeral for an Octopus. We're going to do Smoke and Mirrors, and I think it's Players and Pawns, but I think actually I decided to push that off because I thought 12 issues was kind of enough already. I think there's an unlimited issue as well. So that'll be our next episode. Upcoming interviews include Mark Russell. We have Pat Olive coming back. We have Ariana Marr from the last episode is actually going to be coming back to break down the lettering process of a sample issue, in this case talking about Superman #1 that she kind of put together and had to come up with a lot of the creative choices in terms of how that was put together. So I'm really excited to talk with Ariana about that as well. And there's other interviews that are on the horizon. So please make sure you subscribe to the podcast so you'll be able to get these episodes right away when they get released, which is typically Saturdays, but recently it has been more like Sunday nights. So I do apologize. I'm trying to get back on the Saturday schedule. As good friend of the show, long-term friend of the show, AJ would say, the only person who cares about that schedule is me. But, I still try to uphold myself to a standard. I know that the next episode will definitely go up scheduled on, midnight on when it becomes the Saturday, because I will actually have to get that ready before I leave for a trip, because I'm going to San Francisco for a weekend. So that'll for sure be up on time. Anyways, thanks again for listening to the Comic Shenanigans podcast, and enjoy this interview with Joe Rubinstein. Enjoy. Joe, welcome to the Comic Shenanigans podcast. Thank you for joining us for this episode to talk about your career in comics. There's a lot of things I really want to ask you about, but I guess I should go back to the beginning and ask you when you first kind of interacted with comics, or when comics first became part of your life.
Okay, so I immigrated, and my older cousin had Superman Family Comics. I didn't speak the language, I couldn't read it, so I guess I must have been enthralled by the pictures. Then, like lots of little kids, I used line paper and crayons and drew my own comic books. Then when I was 11 years old, I went to the Art Students League of New York, which is where I was living. And then at 13, I started to be an errand boy at Dick Giordano in the Adam Studio. Then when I was 15, I became an art assistant to people like Wally Wood and Ross Heath. And then when I was 17, I started to freelance for DC. And when I was 19, I started to freelance for Marvel. My first Marvel job being the Avengers 2-in-1 annual that became the basis for the Avengers Endgame movie a mere 42 years later.
So a lot of questions there, because I know you compressed a lot of time all into a quick narrative, but I'm curious, like, how as a youngster do you get hooked up with, continuity? Like, how does that even happen? Because it's obviously...
I went to my very first comic book convention, and when I was 11, I could identify Neil's work and The Phantom Stranger, I remember, because, I wanted to be able to be as real, quote unquote, as possible. And Neil's stuff looked realer than, let's say, Gil Kane or Jack Kirby, as great as they both were. And so I went to my first comic book convention, and miracles, there was Neil Adams at the show with a guy I later worked with a lot named Alan Weiss. And I just said to the guy, I said, do you need anybody to work at your studio? And he said, yeah, we do. And that's how it happened. So I worked there for the summers. And then I would come back after school. And that happened from the age of 13 to 17 when I quit.
Now, I'm curious, when did you know that inking was your avenue into comics? Like, had you thought or pursued of anything else, or?
It's my side Georgia Road. So, what happened was Gil Kane, who was one of the greatest comic artists ever lived, he did a wonderful interview in Alter Ego magazine that Roy Thomas was publishing. And he said, I should have been an inker first to learn the business and then go on to penciling. Well, of course, everybody wants to draw their own comic books. I'm not sure who just wants to be an inker. So I said, well, okay, I'll do that because I have my favorite inker in the world right here, Dick Giordano. And I started to do that stuff. And then Mike Netzer showed up at the studio. And he was drawing samples, and I asked him if I could make Xeroxes of his work and ink over it. And he said, just ink the real thing. I went, really?
Oh, wow.
So I did. And it was Batman fighting Captain America. So Mike was covering both companies. Mike then showed my inks to his editor, Jerry Conway. And Jerry hired me. He was nice enough to hire me at the lowest rate they paid. And the book was appropriately enough called Tales of the Great Disaster. And then Mike and I did 2 of those, and then we went on to do Cobra, and, we got teamed up a lot, but then I started to go off and do other things, and Jim Starlin asked me if I wanted to ink this Avengers annual he was doing. And I was thrilled because that meant, besides the actual work, an entree to John Buscema, Gene Colan, and all the other people who worked at Marvel. And that was it. So I became an inker, and possibly I got too comfortable and too scared and stayed with inking, but I also am a painter. So all the comic book work paid for my painting addiction all these years. And while I'm sure it's a joy for, let's say, John Bogdanov to draw Superman, I think you can name his kid Kal-El, I think. To me, it was a great joy to ink Gene Colan's Dracula and John Buscema's Conan and Gil Kane's whatever, So I got to team up with all these heroes as an inker.
When you're teaming up with heroes like that, how did you... every inker obviously has their own approach to how they kind of want to, influence the art. Were you very concerned about making sure that you elevated what the pencils were, or were you a little bit more interested in seeing how much of yourself you could bring to it as well? How did you kind of toe that line, especially, and I guess it would be different when you're dealing originally, when you're first entering the industry, dealing with industry legends, and then as you progress, you're dealing with more peers.
Well, because I was taught by Dick Giordano, Dick's inking on Carmine looked nothing like Gil Kane, looked nothing like Neil Adams, looked nothing like his own work. Dick believed in the philosophy of altering your approach accordingly to what's presented in front of you. Mm-hmm. Somebody like Alfredo Alcala, Tony DiZuniga, Tom Palmer, all doing magnificent jobs, but they pretty much overwhelmed whoever they were inking. I once said to Murphy Anderson, when you ink somebody's work, what's your thinking? And he said, well, I kind of just do my thing. And that meant he did a Murphy on it. He changed it into Murphy. Mm-hmm. Joe Kubert told me the same thing, that once it's his job, it's his job. Well, I firmly believe that Joe Kubert would not like it if somebody lightly erased his pencils and then turned them into his job, and Murphy likewise. So I wanted to be as pure as I could to the intention of the work in front of me. So, like Dick taught me, change it. Think about what needs to be done. Don't force somebody to be something that they're not. And also, inking is pretty boring. I mean, after a while, you can do it. So if I do it all the same way, all the same time, I'm really bored. So if I think about, all right, I'm making an Eric Larson job, what pen do I use? I don't always use the same pen, depending if I want a very graceful curved line or a choppy kinetic line. What brush do I use? Is it a big fat one? Is it a tiny one? So I'm always trying to think about what's the best tool to get this intention out. And I may use 2 or 3, 4 different pens and brushes in one job. So that at least makes it more interesting for me. And I really think it's a sign of respect, because if, for instance, this will never ever happen, Frank Frazetta, they find an unpublished Frank Frazetta 8-page job, and they give it to Alfredo Alcala to ink. And you buy the comic book, and it says, first Frank Frazetta job in 70 years. And you open up the comic book, and you flip through it, and you can't find the Frazetta job. You go, what happened? And then you look at it, and you find out that it's that beautiful Alcala job you were looking at that doesn't resemble Frazetta in the least. So it's like, well, that's a disappointment. So I wouldn't be the right guy to ink Frank Frazetta, in all honesty. But there's several people like Carrie Gamble who've told me I'm their favorite inker. And that's because I retain what they drew and hopefully help them a little bit. I have no need to shoehorn myself into this stuff. I don't need to express myself and contribute. If you get a John Buscema pencils, your contribution is you're not fucking it up. It's like try and keep it looking like John Buscema. Or Gil Kane. Tom Palmer inked Gil Kane covers on Tomb of Dracula a lot, and they're beautiful. They hardly resemble Gil Kane, which maybe he shouldn't have been cast in the part in the first place. But so if you give me a Gil Kane job, I inked 3 issues of Superman over Gil's work, and I think they look a lot like Gil Kane. And unlike Wally Wood, who again would do a magnificent job, but it wouldn't really look much like Gil Kane when it was done. But if you compare Iron Fist #1, which was inked by Giordano with me assisting, that looked like a Gil Kane job with augmentation on it. Not large breasts, of course, but you know what I mean. And so I just want the stuff to look like what it was handed to me. I don't want a penciler to come to me and go, I can't believe you changed my work, or, oh no, Rubinstein's got another one. So it just makes it more interesting. And again, I want to, like when I inked John Byrne on the Captain America, like 9 issues, which is sort of considered a career highlight for both of us, I think. I read that John said that he tried for the first 10 years of his career to try and look like Neil Adams, and for the next 10 years of his career to not look like Neil Adams. Well, I don't know that he ever looked like Neil Adams, but so when I got the Captain America stuff to do, I went, all right, I'm going to push this stuff about 10% more that way, towards Neil's work. And that's what I did. I think it very clearly reads as Neil Adams, as John Byrne's work. But I just helped it. The definition of an embellisher, I think, is somebody who sews lace on the end of a sleeve or something. So I embellished a little. And I thought the stuff looked really good. So that's what I try to do as an inker, is just to be faithful.
You do have a number of kind of more frequent collaborators or collaborations you've worked on in the past. I'm curious, like when you're working with someone like Ron Frenz on Amazing Spider-Man or Superman, were you guys talking about it? Like, would you guys actually talk about the work, or would you just kind of like when you're trying to understand what he's trying to get across in his line work? Did you ever talk to him about it, or directly, or did you just kind of look at the page?
Well, what I did was when I started with a new person, and I'd never inked before, I would call them up. I would say, I'm inking your job. How do you like it inked? Who's your favorite inker? Who's your least favorite inker? Who did a bad job on you? what if you ink, what do you use, who are your influences, so forth and so on. And it gives me some inkling of how to proceed. Now, ultimately, the pencils tell me how to proceed. Because sometimes people are delusional about their own work. It's like this guy drew, graphite obviously can go from 10% to 100% dark. But in comic book terms, if you drew a section of the background in 50% and the section next to it 100%, what are you expecting me to do? I only have black ink, So it's all going to be 100% unless I'm specifically requested to crosshatch the 50% area to make it open or to add some kind of a tone to make it open. So this one guy said to me, well, you're making everything too dark. I went, you drew it that way. I mean, you can tell me to do something else. But in the case of Ron Frenz, the only note I got from Ron was I was adding darks to Superman's bathing suit. And he said, no, it's not crimson, it's red. So don't add darks to it. So that was pretty much it. So, and only once that I can remember, Adam Hughes, before I started to do his Justice League stuff, called me up. And he had to talk with me before I could get to him. And the confusing part is, as I went along in my career, people would say, well, just think it like, you. So I don't know what that means. I truly don't. Because I don't ink Ron Frenz the way I do Garcia Lopez, the way I do Arthur Adams, the way I do Neil Adams. So it's like, I don't know what's in your head. It's like everything is so subjective and big and ambiguous. It's like, all right, show me. Send me the stuff that you think I should do your work like. And then we'll see.
In your early years in the industry, it felt like you were doing a lot of books here and there. There wasn't necessarily like a thorough line or like a main kind of title for the first little while. Obviously, that's as you kind of getting your feet wet. Did you like kind of jumping around almost like a mercenary, so to speak, in terms of kind of inking here or there? Or did you crave stability so you would have one penciler to embellish on a regular basis?
Oddly enough, Mercenary was my role-playing game. I like that. That's cute. It was probably me. It was probably like I inked 3 issues of Sal Buscema's Hulk, and people speak very well of it to this day. But I think I just went, all right, it's enough. 3 issues on board, and I inked 8 or 9 issues of Dave Cockrum's second run on the X-Men. And I specifically called up Bob Wyachek and went, I'm bored with this. Why don't you call up and take it? And it's not an indictment of the work. It's simply that I get bored doing the same thing. And because I said it's like it's the same job 3 months in a row, that means it's the same brushes and the same pens and all that. And that's what I like in the middle of a run. If somebody gives me like a 6-pager to ink of somebody else's work, so it cleanses my palette, and then I can go back to the stuff. But if it's like, oh, okay, another day of those characters. And I was on Superman for 7 years, but I think besides the incentive of being on a regular employment, which I didn't really have a problem with in those days, it was Dan Jurgens and Steve Immelman and George Genti and 3 or 4 other guys. And so that would make it interesting for me because then I'd have something else to do than the same old stuff.
Fascinating. So I'm curious, it feels like your work on the official Handbook of the Marvel Universe kind of makes sense from that perspective because you're doing so many characters but a lot of different artists, so it kind of keeps you fresh as well.
Yeah, well, as it turned out, I accidentally gave myself that job, which is, in my estimation, the best job an inker ever had. What happened was there was a fanzine magazine called Comic Scene, and Bob Greenberger was the editor, and I would complain to him, when are you going to do something about inkers, because inkers always get no respect. And so finally he set up this round table, except it was square, I seem to remember. It was Bob Layton, Tom Palmer, Klaus Janson, and me. with, I think, Dennis Cowan wandering in at some point. And he had Mike Zeck do a Hulk drawing. Then he gave all the four of us the drawing to ink. Then he published it all on one sheet with the pencils in the middle and then the four images so people could really see the differences. So Mark Grunwald, who was an editor at Marvel, came up to me and said, we're doing this encyclopedia of our characters, and I'd like you to ink these three figures. And I think it was a Ron Frenz, maybe two Ron Frenz, a Brian Postman, can't remember. And he told me the reason he asked me is of the four images he looked at in that article, mine was the closest to the intention of what had been drawn. So I inked them, brought them back. He said, good, how many do you want? I went, all of them. Why would I say anything else? And while it was a completely selfish, self-beneficial act on my part, it was also something that benefited Mark and his editor at the time, Mike Harlan, because now instead of wrangling 7,000 pencilers and 7,000 inkers, it was 7,000 pencilers and me. So he always knew everything just went to me, and that made his life a lot simpler.
What was your relationship with Mark? So I was just going to say, what was your relationship with Grunwald like? Because you were involved with it for such a long period.
Yeah, I know everybody loved Mark. I mean, Mark has his own website, and we love Mark. He passionately loved comics and art, and he had a good sense of humor. He liked to play, and he wasn't bossy and tyrannical. And, you know, the assistant editor, Mike Carlin, has been a lifelong and since death long friend. You can't say that about all the assistant editors to their bosses. And when Shooter left and Marvel changed, and the people who ran it were not good people, and I think Mark was kind of assigned to be the hatchet man at Marvel, and which, you know, of course, he couldn't stand. I think Mark died of a heart attack because his heart was broken. I heard stories that he might have been contemplating going out to do children's books instead of comic books. But it was not a fun thing at Marvel after Shooter left, and I think it really injured Mark. And I was going to tell you something else about Marvel Universe now, and I don't remember. I don't know. Oh yeah. As far as it not being a boring assignment because of my lack of attention span, I made a point of eliciting, is that the word? I solicited different pencilers in on it just to make it interesting for me. So yes, there were the ones you counted on. There was the Ron Wilsons and the Ron Frenz and Brian Postman, all that stuff. But I called up Brian Boland in England to see if he'd do some. Joe Kubert. So I would find people and ask them if they would do it. Dave Stevens said yes, and then he chickened out at the last minute. And I went to see Will Eisner at the School of Visual Arts where he was teaching. And I'd done this drawing of the spirit's head, and I inked it in what I thought was my best Will Eisner imitation to show Will that I wouldn't obliterate or homogenize his work. So I showed it to him. I said, I'd like you to draw this thing. So I said, well, why would I want to do that? I didn't make it up. I went, well, yeah, but it would be fun. He went, well, just think this. And then he drew a spirit figure for me to ink, which I never inked. So I made it more interesting for myself as well.
One of your first, I'll go back to Hotmu in a second, but one of your first kind of ongoings was inking Michael Golden doing the microdots. So what was that like, inking like someone like Golden, who didn't do a ton of comic book work?
Well, he'd done stuff at DC, he'd done some House of Secrets, and he also did, I don't know if it was 6 or 8 page Man Bat job, which I inked, which is why Mike wanted me to ink the microdots.
Okay.
Now the problem is that the editor, Mark Al Milgram from Shooter, just didn't like what Mike was doing. And they wanted me to erase things, and he wanted me to add blacks. And I keep saying, no, the guy is a genius. This stuff is incredible. Leave it the hell alone, you know? And what I did not know was Mike didn't like what I was doing in the least and was asking for me to be fired while I was defending him. it is whatever it is, 40 years ago, and I can't tell Mike to like what he didn't like, and if it had been inked today, I might do it a completely different way, but it's the only way I knew at the time. I went into the offices by happenstance. When you worked in comic books in the 70s, 80s, you had to live in the New York City tri-state area, because there was no FedEx and there was no computer, and you had to hand in the pages or send somebody to hand in the page. You didn't want to risk mailing. So people would hang out at the offices, the studios. Neil Adams' studio was close enough to both places where some people would come by and hang out. So I don't know why I brought that up, but we just all knew each other in those days and worked together in those days. And, I would show up at Marvel and they'd say, the X-Men are late, can you take 2 pages? Okay. So there's 2 or 3 issues of the X-Men when Jim Lee and Scott Williams were doing them that I worked on that I don't have any credit on. Somewhere or another, there's this list of like the most prolific inkers of all time, and I think I'm number 8. The one, they don't know about all the stuff I didn't get credit for, and 2, I've been like criminally unemployed since 1999. So if I'd been actually working for the last 25 years, I'd probably be the most prolific inker I've ever lived, even over Vinnie Colette.
So I'm curious. I know whenever you go to conventions, I think everyone always wants to have you sign the Wolverine miniseries with Frank Miller. So I'm curious. First of all, what brought you on board that project? Did Frank, reach out to you directly, or was it through the editor? And 2, when you guys were doing it, did it feel like it was something special?
Frank's a month older than I am, and he was this skinny kid from Vermont who was eking out a survival with 6 pagers here and there. And I was living at home, and so I didn't have to pay rent. So he'd show up, and every now and again I paid him, I bought him lunch. And we were friendly, and I could see, he was a passionate artist. And since I know surface anatomy, Frank would show me his Daredevil, like Marvel team-up, Spider-Man, Daredevil, and stuff like that. Mm-hmm. And I would tweak his anatomy. Now, I didn't storytell, I didn't draw a page, I'm not taking any credit for Frank Miller's career. I'm just saying he would have me tweak little things here or there. So I guess Frank trusted me because when he did his first issue of Daredevil, I inked the cover. Mm-hmm. And Klaus, of course, did a very fine job, but maybe Frank wasn't sure who would get the cover, so he made sure I would at least. So we were friendly, and people knew each other, and Christmas parties and whatever. And so I'm up at Marvel, and Frank walks up to me and says, "Hey, we're doing this mini-series on Wolverine. You want to do it?" I go, "Yeah." Who knew? Sure, I'll do it. I was a very big fan of the Daredevil stuff, so why would I not want to work with Frank? But, it's like when somebody comes up to somebody who worked on like Gone with the Wind. Like, what was it like? We came in, we did our job, we had lunch, we went out. It was a job, we did it, So I want to do the very best I can do always within the limitations of the ink 10 pages overnight. So, yeah, I'm trying to do the best work I can do. And but I didn't think it was special. I didn't think that it would, have legs and survive forever. I'm grateful it did, mind you. And I think, but the thing is with Frank, I didn't care for what I did on that series in the least. I was embarrassed by it. Really? I did the best I could. I did what I understood to do, but I didn't think I did well at all, and that's because Klaus, who, by the way, was also Dick Giordano's assistant before I was, Klaus was doing what I thought was perfection on Frank's work. I just loved it. And I remember I would get the issue, and I'd read it first, but then I'd go back and look at it. Because if I looked at it, I'd lose the thread of the story, and I would see all this great stuff Klaus was doing. So my work didn't look in the least like what Klaus was doing, but that's because Frank was giving me layouts, which means they're a lot more ambiguous and sketchy than full pencils than what Klaus was getting. So because mine didn't look like the perfection of Daredevil, I thought I had fallen down badly. 25, people would say nice things to me about it. 25 years later, I open up the thing and I look at it and go, yeah, it's not bad. And the story's good. The storytelling's good. Recently, one of the pages sold for $156,000. Another page was a bargain at a measly $125,000. And the cover was in a show in Seattle in a museum, and it was insured for $350,000, which of course means I can't afford me.
It's interesting hearing you talk about it because, like, looking at it now, I'm curious. Like, you're right, you don't know that something is going to end up blowing up and being this thing that people are going to fondly remember. So that you're right, obviously. There, I'm curious about it more in the time period that it was made. The storytelling, some of the choices that Frank made, do feel very singular at the time and not something that you saw a lot of. And obviously, they were allowed to, do a miniseries, which again was not as commonplace at the time.
I think it was the first one.
Was it the first one?
I think that's why it was such a big deal. I think it was the first one.
I think you're right, yeah. So it definitely felt like he went in different places, and just some of the use of space, a lot of white space to kind of accentuate certain things in the storytelling. Was that harder for you as an inker when you have so much kind of space that's not being filled in, that's not being used up? Like, did you feel anything about that?
I'm fine with a white cover. I'm good. No problem. Just give me my rate. I'm cool. I think what happened was Frank and I were coming back to New York from San Diego Comic-Con, and I bought a big stack of Joe Kubert comics, probably Our Army of War. And I showed it to Frank, and I think he became enthralled with the page layouts because there's a certain Joe Kubert influence to how the pages are laid out in which are empty spaces and so forth. And maybe nobody would know, and maybe even Joe Kubert would know. But I got the feeling Frank was very heavily influenced by those books because if you look at the second to last page of Wolverine number 3, it's a full-height portrait of Wolverine with his furry collar. He's looking up and he's contemplating what he was contemplating. And I inked that like Joe Kubert, or as best as I could get, which is a mile away. And he's got this thick furry collar, which I was thinking of for Enemy Ace. When Kubert would stick his elbow into the ink and they just use that for the fur. So I was trying to do Kubert, and I think Frank was trying to draw Kubert for that series. Not to the point of being an imitation. So I think that's where that came from. And also, because they were layouts, just when you thought it was safe to pick up the phone, I would call up Frank and go, page 7, what does that dark there mean? Page 22, did you want to grade? So I was constantly asking him things because it was layouts, not full pencils. So if it was full pencil, I would understand where to go. I think a relatively professional speed to ink a comic book is like 10 days, 2 weeks, maybe. I think the first issue that took me, because I had it, 6 weeks, because I didn't know what the hell I was doing and what he wanted done. And again, I bemoaned the fact that it was all done. It didn't look like Daredevil. But again, yeah, I heard Warren Beatty say that you have no idea what movie you made till 5 years later. And then you can go back out and watch it instead of think what people are looking at.
Why did Frank go so loose then with the pencils compared to, his work on Daredevil?
Oh yeah. That's because he was trying to break the Kirby barrier. There was this. First he was doing Daredevil, so that's one full book a month. And I think what he's trying to, supposedly Jack Kirby could draw like an entire issue of Captain America over the weekend, and it was magnificent. So I think guys played with this idea of can I draw a 22-page book in 7 days and still make it look okay, but not full pencils. So I think that's what Frank was doing. He was trying to break the Kirby barrier and do a book a week.
Of the guys you worked with, who do you think could have done it?
Broken the Kirby barrier?
Yeah.
I don't know. Probably, maybe. I have no clue. I wasn't there. But they're fast. Burn would churn out pages, right? I mean, the story is that Captain America, like, I don't remember the real numbers. Let's say 118 and 120 were done. And people are asking around, the editors are going, well, where's 19? Where's 19? And they finally figured out there was no 19. And it was due. And they called up Jack Kirby and said, Jack, can you draw something for the weekend? And he drew Captain America's origin. And it was done. When I started inking, I was fairly fast. And then I started to know things, and I slowed down because knowledge gets in the way. And now you can't just rip that out and throw this away. And so I was fast, I was slow, and now I'm fast again because I know what I'm doing. So I imagine, I mean, Neil Adams did like a Green Arrow job over the weekend once. I think it was like a 10-page or something, but it was reproduced in pencil. So, if you've been a pro long enough, and you're not like Sandy Plunkett who does one job a year, sure Sal Buscema can do it. I know John Buscema could do it.
I want to talk about your work on Amazing Spider-Man with Ron Frenz. I kind of alluded to it before, and he's a good friend of the show, and I love talking to Ron. I'm curious, like, when he talks about getting the gig on Spider-Man, like, that for him, I know he was only in his 20s at the time, but that was his dream come true. That was the book, his dream book at the time. So what was it like for you to, one, be paired with him, and two, work over him on Amazing Spider-Man? Did that have any significance to you, that it was Amazing Spider-Man, that it was the flagship Spider-Man book? Did that matter to you at all?
I don't remember if I ever worked with Ron before that. Ron, at the beginning of the run, I don't know if it was 4 or more issues, but he was doing full pencils. And then it went to layouts, but very tight, very to the point, nothing ambiguous layouts, so they were green to ink. And I liked them better than the pencils, only because the pencils constricted me. As I said earlier, I'm not about to ignore what's in front of me. But Ron gave me a little more room. I guess I don't remember if I was intimidated or not by being on Spider-Man. I'm sure I was happy to. But I do remember the first time I inked the Batman, going, oh my gosh, Batman. This is not Brad the Power of the Geek. This is not Pred. This is like Batman. So that intimidated me. And then I got a Kurt Swan Superman job to ink. Went, oh my God, it's Mr. Superman, and I got to ink this stuff. Luckily or unluckily, it was a 3 1/3 page job, so there was not a lot of room to find out what was going on. And then decades later, DC calls up and says, "You want to do a Flash job?" I go, "Yeah, sure." And they say, it's by Carmine. I went, oh, great. How come you didn't give it to Murphy? And they said, well, I was just trying something different. And so they sent it over to me, and I realized it was not the contemporary Flash. It was a throwback to Barry Allen Flash. And that was exciting because, oh, my God, I'm inking Carmine Infantino's Barry Allen the Flash. So I'm still enough of a fan where I'm aware that there's some history here and nostalgia. And I'm not sure who I've inked recently that it would be lovely to have inked John Buscema's Conan, for instance, which I did, or Gene Colan's Daredevil, which I did. But so when I'm doing that, see, it's like they may have earned it, and I'm not taking anything away from these guys. But when the fans are going, oh my God, it's Jim Lee, it's Frank Miller, it's John Byrne. Hey, still there?
I'm still here. Yeah, I'm listening.
I heard a weird thing. I don't know. Anyway, so after Adam, so all this reverence to these guys, Bill Sienkiewicz, not Sienkiewicz, Sienkiewicz. But to me, it's like, it's the guys, whatever, But Joe Kubert, Gene Colan, Jack Kirby, Gil Kane, Murphy Anderson, those are the guys, So obviously, it's as a child, who do you admire? So I have no idea why I got on this train, but I'm just it's good to ink the guys, and it's nostalgic when I do the older guys, which are not around anymore. But every now and again, somebody will send me a lovely vintage piece to ink on blue lines, so I still get to do a Daredevil by Gene Colan or a Conan by John Buscema. That's always nice.
I'm curious about when you ink Carmine. Like, obviously, he has a very specific line, like pencil line. So, how did you, as you said, you kind of try to interpret what the artist is trying to do and try to just accentuate what's there without making it look like something that Joe did, right? So, I'm curious, how did you approach a Carmine piece and a Kurt Swan? Like, a Kurt Swan, as you said, like, that's Mr. Superman. So, what was it like to approach that line work? Because, again, both gentlemen had very specific pencil lines.
Right. Well, nothing about Carmine. Carmine had a vaguely frantic kind of doubly line. Like, if you would go one line, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. You know, it's like, it's a little bit ambiguous, or pick which one you want to ink, you know. But the thing with Carmine is, don't turn it into somebody else. Carmine is weird and strangely stylized. And I did a Batman pinup where Batman's on the ledge of an office building or apartment building where you can look into the window and the bad guys are holding this girl, and it was a totally ridiculous piece. The perspective was crazy. The shadow of Batman's body literally wrapped around the building. The guys who were in the window, there was a window below them which went, what? The windows at their knees? I mean, it made no sense whatsoever, and I loved it because it was just Carmine. It was just weirdo Carmine. You know, if Neil Adams had inked it, he would have lightly repenciled it and then inked it to look like a sort of an odd Neil Adams drawing. When Neil inked Kirby on a cover or two, he didn't ink Kirby. He lightly erased it and then redrew it and then inked it. So he wasn't being really faithful to what was going on. When I inked somebody like Gene Colan, Gene had lots of grays, but I don't think he really cared how you achieved that gray, meaning whether you cross-hatched or you stippled or you did a dry brush or whatever it was. I think Gene wanted just that effect going, and then people would interpret it. But you asked me about Carmine, and who was the other one?
Kurt Swan.
Kurt. Oh, Kurt drew magnificently, but Kurt drew with smoke. You thought it was all there, and then you put one line down to say, okay, well, that's where his jawline is, and everything else went away. Where is his head anymore, you know? And so that's why there's so many people who look so different on Kurt's stuff, because it was just up in the air. This is not to say it wasn't beautiful, which it was. But I think the key is, when I would see Kurt ink his own work, I hated it. Because there was a lot of little choppy, scrubby little lines in comparison to something like, I think Kurt's absolute best inkers were Neil Adams, who did a bunch of covers, and Al Williamson. And you go, sacrilege. That's not Murphy Anderson. That's not George Klein. Sacrilege. Like, no. Murphy turned it into Murphy. Klein turned it into Klein. If you look at Kurt's pencils and Al's inks, he tried to keep them. He tried to beautifully drawn, just enough gray, nothing screwing around. And, interestingly enough, adding a third to the best Kurt Swan inkers. I think there was a Larry Niven science fiction writer job called Man of Steel, Woman of Tissue Paper, which the premise was if Clark ever had sex with Lois, the sperm would shoot out the top of his head. Now, I haven't read the story, so if I got it all wrong, pardon me. But they kind of reprinted this job in Penthouse magazine, which was, obviously Penthouse was adult-oriented. And, the first page, it's 4 illustrations. And the first one is obviously Perry White, Lois Lane, Jimmy Olsen looking at this silhouette in classic Superman pose, but it's a black silhouette with an emblem without an S in it. This isn't Superman. We couldn't do this job with this in Superman. Then the next one is Clark's looking using his X-ray vision to look at Lois and Lana naked, and it's like, no, we really couldn't do. I mean, we couldn't do this. This is Superman. And then they show Lois and Clark in bed. And says, no kidding, this isn't Superman, right? So the thing is, because they got Kurt Swan to do it, it's great, and they got Stan Drake, my idol, Neil Adams' idol, Stan Drake to ink it, and it's so exquisitely well drawn that I think it's one of the single best things I've ever seen of Kurt Swan's work. Now, I heard that Kurt got a substantial amount of money for doing it and was thoroughly ashamed and would not acknowledge it after the fact. So, and you know who owns that artwork? Me. So
that's too funny. I'm going to jump ahead. I know we're running close to our time soon. I wanted to ask about some of the things that you kind of did in the 90s that were of particular interest to me as a fan. You were inking over Dan Jurgens actually a fair bit, but specifically in the DC versus Marvel kind of event or stunt that was pulled off in the middle 90s. I'm curious, one, what it was like in general to draw over Jurgens, but also in particular what it was like to do that, because he's, drawing characters that he, up until that point, he would not have been, as used to drawing, because there was a lot of characters crossing over there.
And you call it a stunt because you figured it was a contrived thing just to get sales?
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm not sure that's wrong.
I very much enjoy it. Like, I'm a huge fan of it. I was the right age to enjoy it especially. But looking at it now, it was a stunt to goose sales so that, they could keep sales going.
Yeah,
so.
but it's thrilling. Imagine if Sherlock Holmes shows up in Dodge City in 1886 to find out who's been killing people. So, oh my God, I love crossovers. They did a bunch of movies, I think it was the 80s, where it's Sherlock Holmes and Jack the Ripper, and it's Sherlock Holmes and Sigmund Freud, And I just love those and they're not even different realities. It's just, it never occurred to me that in 1880, when a shogun is having a fight in Japan, that, Davy Crockett is fighting something over there in America. Like, whoa, it's all the same time. That's right. It's just a different world. So anyway, I think it's fun. And those ridiculous old arguments about who would be who, Tarzan or Batman, the Hulk or Superman. Says, well, there it is, guys. I had been inking Dan, I guess, for quite a few years, actually, by that point, on Superman. And so it was, comfortable, familiar. I knew what it was all about. It's fun to see his take on the various characters. And I believe that Claudio Castini, the other guy who's excellent, he was falling behind. So more and more of it was being assigned to Dan and me to do, which was fine with me. So, and from there, I went to do, that was DC vs. Marvel. Right? Then I went to do the Amalgam, or the All Access, where again, it's a bunch of DC and Marvel people fighting. But this time it was all by Butch Guys. So yeah, it's fun. I tell you that I rarely, maybe then rarely, look at something and go, oh, now I'm scared, Because I'll look at a Dan Jurgens drawing and I won't say, I wonder if I can ink that. I just go, yeah, I can do that. And I hope it turns out really well and I can ink, Kerry Gamble, and I can ink all these guys, but occasionally, like the Stan Drake who I mentioned earlier, I got him to draw a couple of figures for Marvel Universe. That was terrifying. Joe Kubert drew a couple of figures. That was terrifying. John Buscema was terrifying. John Severn, somebody who never let anybody else ink him. Brian Boland, and Tom Palmer actually drew one or two figures. And that was terrifying because those are like idols of mine. And now what am I going to do?
Is it extra stressful to ink someone who's primarily known as an inker like Palmer? Because that's a very interesting job, because you have someone who most people would know him as an inker anyway, and now you're inking him.
Yeah, no, not terrifying because he's known as an inker. Terrifying because he's an inker I admire. There were several people who through Marvel Universe pieces who were inkers who, for one, should not have been allowed to draw, and secondly, okay, I've got to go fix this now. So yeah, it's really look. again, if they find a Frank Frazetta drawing and say, here, Joe, ink this, it's like, oh my God, right? Now, I inked Bernie Wrightson several times, and I don't know how much as I tried, it looks like Bernie, but I tried to look like Bernie, but it's Bernie, and you have a preconceived notion of what this stuff should look like when it's done, and it's not going to be me, because I don't have Bernie's line, or Frank Frazetta's line. But I try to accommodate. Steve Lealaha, speaking of it, I know Steve's penciled a lot of stuff, but Steve drew several Marvel Universe entries, and each one was successively harder to do because I think Steve was just putting more into it. And I wrote him, I said, you're going to get this to the point where I'm going to fail, because you're going to make it so good, I'm not going to be able to keep up with it. But I think I did. But yeah, it's really just about the quality of the work. And of course, I look forward to high quality work because when I get somebody who got it, and there were lots of them in Marvel Universe who were interns who wanted to break through, who were friends of a friend, and who were more all right, we'll give them one. And they sucked. And I was specifically instructed to fix them. But when I'm given, like a John Byrne drawing, John does a good, solid Marvel comic book figure. So, or I didn't have to fix a thing. I just had to keep it of the quality it was.
Notably, you did get to work on a bunch of the later Image founders. You worked on a bunch of their kind of earlier work at Marvel. You did some issues of Amazing Spider-Man with McFarlane. You did, with Silvestri, you did X-Men versus Avengers, among others. What was it like to kind of see those guys blow up and then kind of move away from the company, from Marvel, where they kind of cut their teeth?
Well, I watched it passively like anybody else. It's none of my business, but I was, they're starting a new company. Certainly Jim Lee, you could tell right from the bat he was really, really good, and he got really, really better. I think McFarlane stuff, I think that was the thing with people like McFarlane and Liefeld, and even Silvestri up to a point. It was so not the norm that it's like, what is this? Should I like this? Oh, it's different. I don't know if that looks like Peter Parker. That's kind of interesting. The web's interesting. Oh, Silvestri, he's drawing little-headed guys with big bodies. Kind of looks a little like Simonson, but not really. So I didn't necessarily know how to ink them correctly because sometimes you get an old guy who used to do Marvel Comics or was doing comic strips for 30 years and needed another job, and they'd ink somebody, and they were always terrible. It just was wrong because they were superimposing their old style on the modern stuff. And maybe that's what I was doing, since I didn't know exactly what I would make of this new stuff. I don't know if I inked McFarlane right. I think I did. And I did Avengers vs. X-Men with Silvestri. And I think that stuff looks fine. But then you look at the stuff that like Richard Friend did, or Scott Williams, or that whole crowd of Scott Williams imitators. It's like, oh, that's an interesting approach I would have never taken. So maybe that's the one I should have done if I'd known it existed. Or I would have just been a great version of it.
So moving ahead a little bit, so as you said, kind of in the 90s, you're working on Superman for like a good while, and in fact, you're providing the consistency because, as you said, you have different kind of rotating artists coming in and out. You have Jurgens, you have Garcia Lopez, you have Frenz, you have Gil Kane, as you mentioned, doing a couple issues, and then you do a bit of Batman over Manley. I'm curious, what was it like to be putting your stamp on these DC characters after having spent so much of the earlier part of your career at Marvel?
Well, it doesn't matter to me who I'm doing, unless it's a tremendous pain in the ass like Galactus, or War Machine, or Jack of Hearts, It's like, if you took Silvestri and moved it over to Batman, it wouldn't matter to me. As a matter of fact, I was inking Norm Breyfogle on Batman, and then this thing called Anarchy, I think, for 6 or 8 issues. Yeah. And then we went over to do when Veronica Loves Archie, where it's an alternate reality where they're married. And Norm drew exactly. I said, well, why are you doing this? He said, it's the exact same stuff I always do, except to put different heads on them. So he was just drawing Batman, but he's sticking Archie Andrews' head on top. So, yeah, I mean, it's kind of cool to say, look, I'm doing Archie now. But it really all comes down to the immediate stimuli of the pencils. You know, Bryce, like Bill Kane, John Byrne, it's like, I hate doing, like, I would hate to do, I know I would have hated to do Transformers. Probably would hate to do Halo, even though I like the TV show. But if I had to, and I do the best I could do. But it ultimately doesn't matter who the character is. It's nice, by the way, when the pencil's really good, and the story's good, and the colorist doesn't screw it up, and it's a comic book that I don't look at and wince at page 14 because I'll look how badly they colored it. Or I read the thing and I go, oh, that wasn't much, but I got unlettered pages, so what would I know? You know, so it's nice when I have the whole enchilada there. You know, I'm proud of this comic book, and the thing that people ask me about is, what are you most proud of? And I guess as a whole, it would be all the incarnations of the Justice League. The regular one, I can't believe it's not the Justice League, formerly known as the Justice League, because Maguire draws beautifully, though he won't let anyone ink him anymore, so who cares? And Giffen and DeMatteis wrote funny, wonderful stuff, and those books I was proud to be part of because it was all good, all real good. So
it's funny you bring that up because that was kind of my next spot before I let you go, was asking about what was it like to work over Kevin Maguire, because it's interesting because his style is it looks deceptively simple, but there's obviously so much nuance there. And those, again, were very fun stories, but again, they leaned into humor more than, your traditional DC or Marvel comic book. And so it asks a little bit more of the art to be able to convey certain levels of humor. So I'm curious what it was like as an exercise to ink over Maguire.
Well, I mean, Maguire draws very, very well. I don't know if the books would have been as funny with a different penciler, or Giffen started the ball rolling, and I'm sure DeMatteis contributed, but then DeMatteis dialogued, and that was funny stuff. And I don't know, maybe he played off of against some of the expressions which Kevin is so known for, and added to the humor. Kevin's work, he's very slow. There's no way Kevin's going anywhere near the Kirby barrier. So everything is very, very delineated, very, very drawn to the point. Now, you'll say, well, it's simple, but then you look at a guy in chainmail and every stupid chainmail is on him instead of just 3 or 4, or textures or whatever it was. So I recognized that I had to keep it absolutely faithful, unlike, again, let's say a Klaus Janson who would have really dominated it. But to add a little bit of a brush stroke. There's a thing you can do with a brush and hair that you can't do with pencil. There's a little bit of a way you can use a pen that a pencil can't do it. So I was even taking old brushes that had like 2 or 3 hairs sticking out of them and inking Kevin's stuff with that because I wanted a thin, consistent kind of a line. And my job was don't hurt it, like a doctor, do no harm, and keep it looking good. But the whole crowd of us went over to the Defenders, and I was fine with that. And then the editor, whose name shall not be mentioned, said, "Well, why are we using an inker? We could just reproduce from the pencils." Well, Rubinstein's part of it. No, well, we don't need an inker program. And so the thing got published, looks fine, reads fine. I don't think it's good as the Justice League, but it's fine. And every now and again, people would walk up to me at a convention and want me to sign this thing. And they'd look at me sort of sideways and go, "Do you do something different on this?" I go, "Yeah, I didn't ink it." And they noticed that, and so on some level they recognized there was just a little bit of polish that was not there because they were shooting from Kevin's pencils instead of me helping it along with the ink.
Fascinating. I didn't realize that. Well, I knew you hadn't done it, but I hadn't realized the reason for why you didn't kind of travel with the crew. That's really unfortunate.
Yeah, to me too. Well, since comic books have started, I think all the publishers were trying to figure out how to reproduce directly from pencils so we could save money and not use those disgusting inker people. And so, ultimately, it got to the point where you can do that, right? But Captain America 254 is all penciled by Byrne with a cover by Miller that I inked. And people were going, look how well pencil reproduces. See, we don't need an inker. And what happened was, I was up at Marvel's offices, and they had photostats made from all the pencil drawings that John did to reproduce from. But there were all kinds of lines that were falling out and all kinds of black areas which were kind of scrubby and not filled in correctly. So with no pay, I sat there for the day and I reinforced the dropped out lines and I filled in the blacks and I did everything I could. I didn't add exactly, but whatever there, I tried to make sure it didn't fall out.
Mm-hmm.
So when people talk about the old pencil Byrne issue, well, it reproduced. Like, yes, because it's inked. And then, by the way, I think that was the last issue that Byrne and Stern were on, because I showed up and suddenly I was told that everybody quit the book, and what was I going to do? And so John had drawn 6 pages of the next issue, they were about to start this 3-issue Red Skull arc, which I'm sure would have been wonderful. But it never got past 6 pages. So only a few years ago, I got around to inking those 6 pages in my 1982 style. And I think I'm starting a Patreon page, and I'm going to put those things on it so people can actually see what the next issue would have looked like.
Wow. That's awesome.
Thanks.
Well, Joe, thank you so much for taking so much of your time today to chat with me and to kind of go down memory lane with some of these projects. It was really interesting hearing your perspective and your thoughts on inking and your craft and how you approached it. So I really am very thankful and appreciative that you were able to take the time today.
You're welcome. And if anybody ever wants to get a hold of me, I am on Instagram under JOSEF, Josef Rubinstein, and Facebook. So, if anybody needs something, I'm around.
Excellent. Well, again, thank you so much.
You're welcome.